At exactly 1:47 in the morning, a digital eye watching over a quiet suburban street suddenly goes blind when a masked intruder physically severs the connection to a doorbell camera. Exactly 41 minutes later at 2:28 in the morning, a life-saving medical device planted deep inside the chest cavity of an 84-year-old woman inexplicably loses its Bluetooth connection to the cellular phone resting quietly on her bedroom nightstand. A 41-minute gap of absolute digital silence now stands between a peaceful night and a violent abduction. What unfolds inside a darkened residential home for 41 excruciating minutes between an armed suspect and a medically vulnerable senior citizen who relies on a steady stream of heart medication to survive? The answer to this terrifying question does not lie in the flawed memories of eyewitnesses or in partial fingerprints dusted from a windowsill. The truth is buried deep within the invisible radio frequencies and digital signals broadcasting from inside a human body. When human eyes are closed and security cameras are violently disabled, the machines we rely on to keep us alive become our only remaining witnesses. Welcome back to Evidence with John, where we meticulously track the forensic footprints and digital breadcrumbs left behind in the darkest and most complex criminal investigations imaginable. So, if you want to understand how a severed digital cord and a disrupted medical signal became the center of a nationwide manhunt, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, as we carefully piece together the chilling timeline of a disappearance that absolutely shocked the nation and exposed the fatal flaws in how we protect our most vulnerable citizens. We are going to examine every single second of that 41-minute void to understand how a life can vanish into the desert night while leaving a trail of data that no criminal could ever think to erase. The timeline is broken, but the data never truly dies, and it is time to look at what those silent machines recorded when no one else was watching. Every heartbeat recorded before that total digital blackout tells a story of a woman who was perfectly safe in her own bed. Every missing heartbeat after 2:28 in the morning points toward a highly calculated intrusion by someone who understood exactly how to navigate the shadows, but fundamentally misunderstood how modern medical technology tracks our every single move. Being the mother of a famous television personality brings a unique kind of invisible pressure to everyday life. Nancy Guthrie broadcasts to millions of homes every single morning, establishing a highly visible and incredibly public family profile that makes privacy a rare commodity. Yet, despite this massive national spotlight, 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie navigated her daily routines with a profound sense of quiet independence. On the afternoon of January 31st, at exactly 5:32 in the evening, she simply ordered an Uber and rode across town to share a warm dinner with her daughter, Annie. According to reports reviewing the Uber dashcam footage from that specific afternoon drive, the journey was entirely routine, showing absolutely nothing unusual or threatening in the hours leading up to the nightmare. She was an elderly woman enjoying a standard family evening, completely unaware that the countdown to a massive forensic mystery had already begun ticking. Nancy was not someone who could easily fight off an attacker or survive for long periods in harsh conditions without direct medical intervention. Her survival depended heavily on a strict regimen of heart medication and the flawless mechanical operation of her pacemaker. This medical fragility is the exact reason why the events of that night transform from a standard missing persons case into an immediate biological ticking clock, where every passing hour drastically reduces the mathematical probability of survival. At 9:48 in the evening, after the family dinner concluded, a relative named Tommaso Cioni drove Nancy back to her quiet home. He did exactly what any caring family member would do, by waiting patiently in the driveway to ensure she made it inside safely. He watched as she entered the house, and at exactly 9:50 in the evening, the heavy motorized garage door began its slow descent toward the concrete floor. That mechanical humming sound of the garage door sealing shut was the final moment of absolute safety. The door closed completely, locking the 84-year-old woman inside her home, and entirely severing her from the protection of the outside world. It was a completely ordinary end to a completely ordinary day. She was entirely alone, in a sealed suburban fortress surrounded by the quiet darkness of a winter night. But a locked door only provides the illusion of safety when someone is already watching the house and waiting for the streetlights to dim. That heavy wooden door did not just lock the dangers of the outside world away from her frail body. It unknowingly locked her inside the house, with a catastrophic vulnerability that would soon be exploited by a masked figure stepping out of the desert shadows. Sunday morning arrived with a deafening silence that immediately triggered a deep sense of dread within the family. Nancy was a woman of routine and faith, so when she failed to log on and attend her scheduled online church service on the morning of February 1st, the underlying tension finally snapped into outright panic. An 84-year-old woman dependent on heart medication simply does not vanish and miss her digital appointments without a catastrophic reason. The family desperately tried to make contact, but only heard the terrifying sound of unanswered rings echoing through an empty house. At exactly 12:03 in the afternoon, the family made the agonizing decision to dial 911 and request an immediate welfare check. When local law enforcement officers finally breached the perimeter of the home, they did not find an elderly woman who had simply wandered off or suffered a sudden medical emergency in the hallway. They found a chillingly quiet residence that felt completely abandoned. The air was thick with the immediate realization that a violent disruption had occurred inside these supposedly safe walls. Investigators immediately began searching for the digital eyes that guard modern homes and quickly located the doorbell camera footage from the previous night. What they saw on that screen instantly escalated the situation from a routine welfare check to a terrifying criminal investigation. The footage clearly showed an unidentified figure wearing a mask approaching the property under the cover of darkness. At exactly 1:47 in the morning, this masked individual deliberately and methodically severed the connection to the camera, throwing the entire security system into total blindness. This was not a confused neighbor or a random act of vandalism. This was a highly calculated and intentional blinding of the home by someone who knew exactly how to dismantle digital security before executing their plan. The sheer terror of this incident does not come from the blurry image of the masked man approaching the door. The true horror stems from the realization of what that disabled camera could no longer see. The local police were now standing inside a home, where a medically fragile woman had been systematically targeted by a predator who had successfully cloaked their actions in absolute darkness. Every second that ticked by without her heart medication pushed Nancy closer to a fatal medical failure. The officers knew they were no longer looking for a lost grandmother. They were actively hunting a phantom who had somehow managed to extract an 84-year-old woman from a locked house without leaving an obvious trail of destruction. But as the investigators stepped back outside to examine the exterior of the property, the terrifying reality of the situation finally bled out into the open air. The chilling truth was waiting for them right on the front porch. A stark red stain against the concrete shattered any lingering hope that Nancy had simply been coerced or frightened into leaving the property. Investigators discovered a distinct pool of blood resting ominously on the front porch of the residence. Subsequent DNA testing rapidly and definitively confirmed that the blood belonged directly to Nancy Guthrie. This biological evidence instantly transformed the porch into the epicenter of a violent crime scene, proving that an altercation had occurred and that the 84-year-old woman had been actively bleeding before she vanished into the night. But what happened next at this critical forensic juncture represents one of the most catastrophic administrative failures in the history of modern local law enforcement. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, who was officially commanding the initial stages of this highly sensitive investigation, made a decision that completely derailed the forensic integrity of the case. In a move that continues to baffle legal experts and crime scene technicians, Sheriff Nanos prematurely released the crime scene back to the public domain before the forensic teams had completely finalized their exhaustive biological sweep. The chain of custody is the absolute sacred foundation of any criminal prosecution, and maintaining the sterile environment of a crime scene is the only way to ensure that physical evidence holds weight in a court of law. By returning the scene too early, Sheriff Nanos effectively shattered that chain of custody. The immediate result of this administrative blunder was an absolute media feeding frenzy. Journalists and news crews flooded the previously secure area, and local press photographers were actually able to walk right up to the porch and take high-resolution photographs of Nancy Guthrie's blood still stained on the concrete. The physical evidence was entirely compromised. The sterile perimeter was destroyed by the footprints of reporters and camera crews. This agonizing failure means that even if the masked intruder is caught, a competent defense attorney could easily argue that the entire crime scene was severely contaminated by unauthorized personnel, making the blood evidence legally questionable during a murder trial. How could a seasoned sheriff allow a violent crime scene involving a high-profile abduction to be trampled by the evening news crews? This level of systemic failure completely jeopardizes the pursuit of justice and practically hands the perpetrator a customized get-out-of-jail-free card. If you find yourself absolutely enraged by this blatant mishandling of crucial biological evidence, make sure you hit the like button on this video right now, as we continue to expose the glaring errors that nearly buried the truth in this case. The local authorities had completely lost control of the narrative, and the physical evidence was compromised beyond repair. Someone with a higher level of forensic discipline urgently needed to step in before the trail went entirely cold. Recognizing the disastrous mishandling of the primary crime scene by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially stepped in and completely took over the massive manhunt. The FBI immediately pushed the local authorities aside and began applying federal resources to reconstruct the shattered timeline. By February 10th, the federal agents had processed enough digital fragments to finally release a comprehensive physical profile of the suspect to the terrified public. They announced that they were hunting a male suspect, standing approximately 5'9" to 5'10" tall, who was confirmed to be armed and highly dangerous. But the most specific detail, released by the FBI, was the exact type of gear the suspect was carrying during the abduction. Images extracted from surviving digital fragments showed the masked man wearing a very distinct 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack in a solid black color. This specific backpack became the absolute visual centerpiece of the federal manhunt. With the local blood evidence heavily compromised, the FBI desperately needed to find new physical artifacts that had not been trampled by the local media. They began a massive grid search of the surrounding desert and roadways, hoping the suspect had discarded items while fleeing the scene. Hope briefly flared when search teams discovered a pair of discarded gloves lying on the side of a road exactly 2 miles away from the Guthrie residence. It seemed like the perfect breakthrough, a careless mistake by an otherwise calculated phantom. The gloves were immediately bagged and rushed to the federal crime lab for rapid DNA extraction. But the forensic results delivered a crushing blow to the momentum of the investigation. The DNA recovered from the gloves did not match the victim, and did not match any known profiles connected to the crime. It was a complete dead end, a piece of random roadside debris that only served to waste precious investigative hours. As the traditional physical evidence continued to crumble and lead to frustrating dead ends, the federal agents realized they needed to completely shift their investigative strategy. They could no longer rely on blood droplets on a contaminated porch or discarded clothing on a dusty highway. The physical world was failing them. They needed to look deeper into the invisible realm of digital signatures and biometric tracking. The FBI knew that a man carrying a 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack might be able to evade physical detection in the desert, but he could never hide from the relentless pinging of satellites and Bluetooth receivers. They stopped looking at the ground and started looking at the data streams flowing invisibly through the air. They focused entirely on the fact that Nancy was highly dependent on her pacemaker, a medical device that does not just regulate a heartbeat, but constantly transmits its operational status to a paired cellular device. The suspect had violently severed the Intiva doorbell camera to create a zone of darkness, but he was completely unaware that the victim, its own heart, was silently broadcasting a forensic timeline that no mask could ever hide. The investigation was about to pivot from a botched local crime scene into one of the most sophisticated bioforensic tracking operations in federal history. Just as federal profilers began tearing through the digital framework of the surrounding neighborhood, a bizarre new element injected itself into the already chaotic atmosphere surrounding the investigation. Multiple major news outlets reportedly started receiving cryptic electronic communications, demanding massive financial payouts. These alleged digital messages insisted on receiving millions of dollars, specifically transferred through untraceable, decentralized cryptocurrency networks. The anonymous senders claimed to hold the fate of the missing matriarch in their hands, promising her safe return only upon absolute confirmation of the massive digital deposits. This sudden development threw the working theories of behavioral analysts into a severe state of whiplash. The entire premise of a highly organized ransom operation presented a glaring logical paradox that experienced investigators struggled to reconcile. Executing a successful abduction for profit requires keeping the high-value target alive long enough to facilitate a complex monetary exchange. Choosing a medically compromised octogenarian who requires daily pharmaceutical intervention and specialized internal hardware is a logistical nightmare for any organized criminal syndicate. The mathematical margin for error in keeping such a captive breathing is virtually non-existent. Without constant access to her specific daily pharmaceuticals, a captive would likely succumb to heart failure long before any cryptocurrency could be safely laundered through international servers. This blatant contradiction forced detectives to seriously reconsider the psychological profile of the phantom who violently breached the quiet residence. Was this truly a sophisticated criminal syndicate executing a flawlessly planned ransom, or were these cryptic messages simply opportunistic scavengers preying upon a highly publicized tragedy? From the safety of a remote keyboard, the possibility of fraudulent actors attempting to monetize, the agony of a prominent family is a well-documented phenomenon in high-profile disappearances. The digital landscape is filled with predators who use anonymous routing to extort grieving families. If the electronic communications were nothing more than a cruel diversion, the true motive remained entirely buried under layers of confusion. A secondary and far more terrifying theory began to take root among the crime scene analysts, reviewing the shattered remnants of the perimeter. Perhaps the initial intention of the masked suspect was never abduction at all. The behavioral markers could easily point toward a standard property invasion intended to exploit a supposedly empty suburban dwelling under the cover of darkness. In this chilling scenario, an opportunistic thief expected a quiet sweep of valuables, but unexpectedly encountered a resident who was entirely awake or easily alerted by the breach. The resulting confrontation, escalating rapidly from a routine property crime into a panicked abduction, would perfectly explain the frantic departure and the undeniable physical violence indicated at the threshold of the home. A common burglar violently morphing into a kidnapper operates on pure adrenaline and terror rather than a calculated strategy. This chaotic evolution of intent would logically explain why a supposedly professional ransom operative would select a target with such a massive physiological liability. However, investigating both the alleged cryptocurrency demands and the botched home invasion theory simultaneously drained incredibly valuable hours from the federal task force. Field agents were actively forced to deploy dedicated cyber units to trace the encrypted origins of the financial demands, while ground teams continued to sweep the arid landscape for any physical sign of a struggle. The investigative resources were stretched incredibly thin across two entirely contradictory narratives. They were actively hunting a meticulous mastermind and a panicked intruder at the exact same time. The local community watched in absolute horror as the official narrative fractured into these confusing and contradictory directions. You really have to wonder what goes through the mind of a federal investigator when the limited evidence points to a professional extraction and a clumsy burglary in the very same breath. Let me know your prevailing theory down in the comments below, because figuring out whether this was a targeted financial extraction or a tragic collision of circumstances is the absolute key to understanding the mindset of the suspect we are tracking. While the public furiously debated the validity of the decentralized currency demands, the federal bioforensic team completely isolated themselves from the deafening noise of the media circus. They inherently knew that human motivations could be easily faked and electronic mail could be spoofed through foreign proxy servers, but physiological data simply cannot lie. The specialized digital analysts turned their entire focus toward the proprietary software, linking the internal cardiac hardware to the local cellular network. They fully understood that resolving the terrifying contradiction of the suspect required stripping away all the psychological guesswork and returning to the absolute certainty of biological telemetry. The answer was not hiding in the mysterious emails. The answer was waiting to be discovered inside the encrypted logs of a medical corporation. The investigators prepared to dive deeper into the biometric data than any local detective had ever gone before, seeking the undeniable truth hidden in the code. The true breakthrough in this maddening investigation did not come from a dramatic interrogation room confession or a discarded weapon. The most chilling revelation of the entire case emerged from a sterile laboratory where federal technicians meticulously analyzed lines of hexadecimal code extracted directly from proprietary servers of a medical technology company. This specialized team was tasked with examining the exact operational logs of the internal cardiac device implanted within the victim. What they discovered hidden inside those mundane data packets fundamentally altered the trajectory of the manhunt and definitively answered the most terrifying question of the night. The data analysts focused their absolute attention on that agonizing void of time separating the destruction of the external surveillance and the final biological transmission. They needed to know exactly what was happening inside the walls of that house while the rest of the world slept. The cardiac software continuously monitored the electrical impulses of the heart and transmitted that highly sensitive data via a localized Bluetooth signal directly to a cellular phone sitting completely undisturbed on a bedroom nightstand. This proximity-based connection required the internal device and the external phone to remain within a very specific physical distance of one another to successfully communicate. By carefully extracting the microsecond timestamps from the proprietary server, the federal technicians successfully reconstructed the invisible digital environment of the crime scene. The data revealed a truth so precise and undeniable that it completely eclipsed any traditional physical evidence. When the masked individual violently severed the exterior optical sensors, the internal cardiac monitor continued to function perfectly. The physiological data logs proved definitively that the victim was alive, and that her heart was maintaining a viable rhythm inside the residence for a prolonged period after the initial breach. The intruder had successfully plunged the exterior of the property into darkness, but he was entirely unaware that he had just stepped into an invisible web of localized radio frequencies. For an excruciating duration, the situation inside the home remained contained. The data proves that the suspect had completely neutralized the victim and held her captive within the interior walls of her own sanctuary. He was systematically executing his plan while the microscopic transmitter in her chest silently documented her continued survival. The tension in that federal laboratory must have been absolutely suffocating as the technicians watched the timestamps tick forward on their monitors, knowing exactly what was coming next. The steady stream of encrypted biological telemetry continued to flow seamlessly from the chest cavity to the nightstand, verifying her presence in the room. But then the data hit a catastrophic wall. At exactly 2:28 in the morning, the localized Bluetooth connection between the internal medical implant and the stationary cellular device was completely and violently severed. The signal did not simply fade due to a low battery or degrade due to a software malfunction. The digital handshake was broken because the internal transmitter was physically, forcefully, and rapidly moved beyond the maximum operational range of the localized receiver. This was not a system error. This was the exact microsecond of the abduction. The federal technicians had just identified the precise bioforensic footprint of the crime. That severed Bluetooth connection represents the exact moment the masked intruder physically forced the octogenarian across the threshold of the property and dragged her away from the safety of her localized network. The invisible tether connecting her to the digital world was snapped. The agonizing void of time was finally explained. The suspect had spent exactly 41 minutes inside the residence before initiating the extraction phase. He likely believed he had committed the perfect crime by destroying the cameras and avoiding the immediate detection of local patrols. He thought he was disappearing into the night without leaving a single trace of his timeline, but he was profoundly mistaken. He could not see the microscopic radio waves transmitting through the air. He could not destroy a machine buried safely beneath human tissue. The absolute brilliance of this discovery is that it provided investigators with an unshakable temporal foundation that no defense attorney could ever dismantle. Human witnesses can be discredited, and traditional crime scenes can be hopelessly contaminated by careless local deputies. But raw data, extracted from a proprietary server, is mathematically absolute. This single disconnected signal transformed a chaotic and contaminated investigation into a highly precise chronological map. The investigators now possess the exact starting gun for the suspect's escape route, allowing them to precisely calculate potential travel distances and intersect those calculations with regional traffic data. The phantom was finally tethered to reality. We are about to look at the tragic aftermath of this undeniable discovery, but first, make sure you are Subscribe to Evidence with John, so you never miss a breakdown of the incredible digital techniques used to catch the most elusive criminals on the planet, armed with the undeniable chronological certainty provided by the bioforensic telemetry. The federal task force rapidly escalated their operational parameters. The devastating reality of the severed Bluetooth connection eliminated any lingering administrative hesitation regarding the classification of the disappearance. The local jurisdictional leaders who had previously stumbled through the initial hours of the crisis were finally forced to formally and publicly declare the situation a confirmed hostile abduction. This official designation unlocked massive reservoirs of federal funding and allowed the deployment of highly specialized tactical recovery units across multiple state lines. The investigation was operating with absolute clarity, but the terrifying reality of the biological ticking clock remained a constant source of dread. To maximize the pressure on the criminal underworld, the prominent television anchor, acting as the primary spokesperson for her devastated relatives, authorized an unprecedented financial incentive. A staggering $1 million cash reward was officially established and broadcast across every major national media syndicate. This massive financial deployment was designed to shatter any alliances within the criminal community by offering an immediate and life-altering sum of money for actionable intelligence. The strategy was clear. Someone in the peripheral orbit of the suspect would inevitably prioritize a $1 million payout over their loyalty to a phantom. The immense gravitational pull of this celebrity-connected tragedy completely consumed the national news cycle. Dedicated programming interrupted standard broadcasts to analyze every newly released detail regarding the tactical gear and the digital timeline. But this overwhelming saturation of coverage inadvertently triggered a profound and deeply uncomfortable conversation regarding the systemic inequities present within missing persons investigations. Advocates and independent journalists began pointing out the glaring disparity in resource allocation. They highlighted the agonizing reality that thousands of ordinary families endure the exact same nightmare without the benefit of a massive financial reward or the immediate intervention of specialized federal bioforensic teams. The intense spotlight illuminating this specific desert abduction cast a harsh and unavoidable shadow on the countless unresolved cases gathering dust in local precincts across the country. The profound disparity in media attention continues to fuel heated debates among legal scholars and community activists who demand equal dedication for every vanished citizen, regardless of their family connections or financial status. The nationwide manhunt became a mirror, reflecting the uncomfortable truth about how society values different victims. While the federal technicians had successfully mapped the exact microsecond the victim was pulled into the darkness, they were still battling the vast, unforgiving geography of the region. The meticulous reconstruction of the timeline proved how the crime was executed, but it could not pinpoint the final destination. The localized data could only tell investigators when the journey began, not where it ended. The most frustrating aspect of this entire technological triumph is that despite mapping the digital footprints perfectly, the physical reality remains brutally stubborn. The authorities know exactly what the suspect was carrying, and they know exactly when. He crossed the threshold, but the vast expanse of the desert holds its secrets tightly. The specific dark-colored tactical bag identified by the federal agents remains a ghost. It has not been pawned, discarded, or recovered by any regional search team. The digital timeline is absolutely flawless, but the physical location of the victim and that specific piece of carrying equipment remains the most agonizing unanswered question of the entire ordeal. The search for the missing octogenarian continues to this very day, driven by the mathematical certainty of the biological timeline and the desperate hope of a grieving family waiting for a final resolution. The data provided the map, but the destination is still hidden in the shadows. How does a man burdened with an abducted senior citizen and carrying a highly identifiable piece of equipment simply vanish from the physical world without crossing a single optical sensor or triggering a single automated license plate reader? The investigation transformed from a localized failure into a technological marvel, only to crash headfirst into the terrifying reality of an infinite landscape. The silence of the desert is ultimately louder than the ping of a severed network connection. What this case teaches us about the fragility of local law enforcement is both profound and deeply concerning from a systemic perspective. We frequently operate under the assumption that official badges and uniforms guarantee a sterile and competent preservation of truth. However, this investigation serves as a stark analytical reminder that the entire American judicial framework is only as robust as its weakest procedural link. When initial, responders fundamentally fail to protect the biological integrity of a scene by prioritizing media access over scientific preservation, they actively dismantle the chain of custody. This critical failure demonstrates that even the most overwhelming physical evidence can be rendered entirely useless in a courtroom if the initial administrative protocols are compromised by human error. The system does not fail in the courtroom, it fails on the front porch during the first critical hours of discovery. Simultaneously, this incident provides a masterclass in the evolutionary nature of modern forensic science. We have officially entered an era where the concept of a digital footprint extends far beyond standard browser histories and casual social media interactions. The proliferation of the Internet of Things has fundamentally transformed our own bodies into localized data servers. Specialized medical hardware and automated home environmental sensors continuously broadcast our physiological states to proprietary networks. These silent machines possess a level of chronological objectivity that completely supersedes the inherent flaws and biases of human memory. A witness can be intimidated or confused by trauma, but an encrypted data packet transmitting a cardiac rhythm is mathematically absolute. The intersection of these two lessons reveals a terrifying modern reality. While our technology has evolved to provide flawless and unshakable timelines, the human institutions tasked with interpreting and protecting that data remain dangerously susceptible to incompetence and procedural collapse. This stark dichotomy between flawless data and flawed human execution will define the future of criminal justice. The agonizing contrast between a perfectly recorded biological timeline and a complete physical disappearance makes this investigation truly unforgettable. An innocent elderly woman was physically dragged into the unforgiving darkness, leaving behind absolutely nothing but an invisible trail of severed radio frequencies and silent digital screams. The technology worked flawlessly to document the exact microsecond of the crime, but it could not reach out and stop the masked perpetrator from vanishing into the arid landscape. We are left with perfect data and an imperfect resolution. But what happens when the digital footprint left behind is not just an automated telemetry signal, but the actual terrified voice of the victim themselves? Next week, we are unlocking the vault on a deeply disturbing investigation, where a desperate target deliberately recorded a chilling audio confession of their own impending doom before completely dropping off the face of the earth forever. The audio they left behind will absolutely freeze the blood in your veins. Make sure you subscribe to Evidence with John and turn on all of your notifications so you do not miss that incredible narrative breakdown. Stay safe and always remember that your devices are watching even when you close your eyes.